Our first group of speakers are reinventing the wheel, as we say, in a realm that's very close to many of us, and that is education. A renewed focus on strategies in education deserves our attention today more than ever, and no one knows that better than our next speaker. She has successfully managed a long career in education, working as a high school teacher, an elementary school principal, an adjunct instructor in educational leadership for UVA's Curry School, and today as the superintendent of Albermarle County Schools here in Charlottesville. As the overseer of a district with over 13,000 students and 1,100 teachers, she has helped make Albermarle County Public Schools one of the top districts in the state of Virginia. TEDxUVA is proud to present a true visionary in education and a proud UVA parent, Dr. Pamela Moran.
It's great to be here. I'm also a mom of a UVA alum, so I'm very proud to be here with you today. I also am aware that I'm speaking to a group of people who represent our millennials and neo-millennials. But the group that I'm really concerned about as a superintendent happens to be what's now being labeled as Gen S, which means Generation Screen. So one of the things that I realize as a superintendent is that we have to transform learning for children who are going to live in their century and not mine. I was drawn to using a Jefferson quote because when you're in Albemarle County, Jefferson dominates so many of our conversations about education. But interestingly, despite his advocacy and championship of public education, I wanted to turn to a contemporary who sees our world through a 21st century lens. That's a person who actually is a professor and chair and department head and I believe director of the School of Engineering Pratt Institute at Duke University, and he is in charge of entrepreneurship and research into commercialization. I read a recent article by him. He is considered to be an entrepreneur, a writer, a thinker in his own right that probably has a great stature, similarly to Jefferson in our day and age. He said something I found very interesting. He said, this decade will be the most innovative decade in history, and interestingly, that it will not be governments who will lead that, but the world's entrepreneurs. Now, when I think about entrepreneurs, I think about people who are explorers, discoverers, pioneers, who go out and settle new territory. And for me as an educator, I really believe that our teachers have to see themselves in that role as well if we're going to transform our schools from 20th century environments into schools for the children that are in our schools today. So one of the things that I think about is that when I was actually a young student, that I thought of school as a place, a location where I went to find books and teachers. But in this day and age, that's no longer true. You can learn in a coffee shop. You can learn in your home. You can learn in a traditional classroom. You can learn even in a car. And I had a parent tell me a story recently that led me to think very deeply about how location has really become space when we think about learning. And it goes something like this. This parent said, when I picked my two children up from school recently, Pam, and we were driving home, we were listening to the radio, and my younger child asked, where's Syria? Now, as a parent, I thought very typically and said, why don't we go to the library and find a book and we'll look it up? However, my older child had grabbed my iPhone off the seat, had quickly used Google Earth, and was showing my younger child where Syria was on Google Earth within 45 seconds. That's a wake-up call for us in education. Learning can happen anywhere, and if we're going to look at how technologies are transforming the world, we have to think about that in regards to how we are also transforming the learning environments in which our students live. So, as a superintendent, I think about things such as this, that in educating kids today, we don't live in a world that is a four-choice, one right answer bubble test world. Yet that's what we do oftentimes with our children in schools. We had a group of young people who played the World Peace Game who were at the Pentagon last spring, and they were told by Pentagon policymakers, one of the great things about the work you're doing with the World Peace Game is you're learning how to generate non-standard solutions to non-standard problems. That's really important. So as a superintendent, I see us as needing to move away from the way that we educated in the past, which was more about factory school environments. That's why many of the traditions we have in schools are that way today, and looking at how we're educating kids for contemporary learning. Now, one of the things that I also think about is that we need a new renaissance of thinkers and citizens. We need our kids to grow up, just as you are now entering or close to entering the workforce, as people who are creators, who are problem solvers, who are makers, who are designers, who are engineers, builders, composers, who represent the best of every discipline in the way that you do your work. So I think about, we've got to really make some changes in education if we're going to educate kids to be that way in the 21st century, in their century. So we talk about something that looks like this. We talk about kids who can, through sustaining and developing their leadership qualities, their innate creativity, their capability to think and act critically, particularly given the barrage of information that comes at us today, that we know that our young people need to be able to be in a different kind of learning environment than the dominant environment of the 20th century, which looked like a dominant teaching wall, looked like kids sitting in rows, looked like paper textbooks, and isolated classrooms. Instead, our kids need to be able to access learning that looks more like collaboration, connectivity, and being able to access the world's resources and expertise in every day that they work and live in our schools. So when I think about that, one of the things that I oftentimes go to is thinking about those stories that really motivate me to think differently. And here's one. Last year I had an opportunity to walk into one of our high school government classes, and these were a group of young people who had been Skyping with an Egyptologist all year long and talking about the unfolding of the revolution in Egypt. And so they were back and forth with him over the course of the year. After the session that I attended, I listened to the young people debrief what they had heard. And this Egyptologist had described that he was feeling a little down about the fact that the revolution was not going towards democracy in the way that he thought that it would. The kids started having a conversation about what was it like for the American revolutionaries when they were going through that process. Did they share those kinds of feelings as well? And so they were really taking apart, comparing and contrasting, and thinking very critically about the American Revolution as it compared to the Egyptian Revolution, something they were seeing boots on the ground through the eyes of a person who was there. That's a really different kind of learning. Now, the other thing that I think about is that in this day and age, we no longer need the kind of factory schools that we did have in the 20th century that were developed for exactly the purpose of creating passive, dependent workers who would start and stop work based on time cards, whistles, and bells. So if you think about your own experiences in schooling, you remember that much of your work started and stopped based on bells. We also don't need workers who depend on a supervisor to tell them what to do every step of the way through their school day or their work day. So in Albermarle, we've been trying to really make changes to rapidly prototype some things differently. You're probably seeing some of those images behind me right now. So here's the things that we're thinking about. We would like to be able to educate our children differently and in ways that allow them to be able to become the leaders, the people with great service commitments in their own communities, as well as to people who are generating up great ideas for the 21st century, so that they will be able to go out into their communities, their state, their nation, and into the world, and share what it is that they know and are learning as they continue to grow and learn over this next century. Now, how are we doing that? We're rapid prototyping a number of different ways that we see school as shifting across Albermarle County. One of the things that I will tell you that I think is a critical piece of it is that we know that our learners today need to be able to access learning that is customized, that is personalized, that can be done anytime, anywhere, inside and outside the walls of schools and across even the boundaries of our school division. So another story that I would share with you that I think represents what that looks like happens to be one from a third grade. And I have to tell you that it's kind of interesting because I have a third grade teacher who has a Twitter account. And it's a class Twitter account. And one day when his kids were doing a simple machines unit last year, one of the kids asked a question. And the question was something like this: is a straw a simple machine? And the kids in the class got in an argument about that. So the teacher said, I could have taken the kids to the library, or I could have possibly given them an answer that I thought would work. But instead, what I did was I put that question out on Twitter. And here's what happened. An astronaut with NASA who was down in Texas quickly replied. Then I had scientists at the New York Hall of Science who weighed in. And then physicists at the University of Nottingham saw the question, and they put their thinking into it. Pretty soon, the teacher had to open a Google Doc to record all of the different arguments that the physicists were asking about that very simple question. At the same time, the kids in class were doing their own test and inquiry to see if they could figure it out. And the teacher was interpreting back and forth with the kids what all these scientists were arguing about. Now, that's a different way of learning, where these kids were able to access the expertise of the world beyond just that classroom. That's the kind of work we're describing that we think that kids in this century need for their learning. So, to move on, as we move towards something that looks more like a renaissance of citizens and thinkers who really fill a world with not people who are passive, dependent learners, but people who are active, engaged, curious, passionate, interested learners, that means that we have to really think about how do we build that out. So in Albermarle, we've really gone after building that out through what we consider to be prototyping of redesigned learning spaces, and you've seen some examples of that. We are looking at different kinds of tech applications. We don't see technology as delivering learning, we see it as enabling it. So how do we use our technologies differently? And then lastly, how do we shift pedagogies? Because if you're a student in school and what you're always getting looks like what I'm doing right now, then you're in that passive mode versus that more active, engaged mode that we're looking for. So we're looking for pedagogies that help to shift the way that our kids interact in engaging ways in class. Now, moving through that, let me tell you about some of the things that we're doing. For example, we have right now across the county, we're prototyping what's called Coder Dojos. That comes from Ireland, and it basically is creating informal environments where our kids are learning how to program. From 5 years old to 18, from C++ to Scratch, which was developed at MIT, and kids in multi-age groups. So younger and older kids working together. Seeing a 7-year-old teach a middle schooler how to program a website using HTML is pretty awesome. Now, we also have academies that we're building out across our high schools. And an example of that would be something that looks like this. We have kids who are studying STEM engineering, and they're building things like quadcopters. We have kids that are learning how to do science, health, and medical areas by case studies. We have kids doing 3D printing in our elementary schools. And in fact, I have something that was a wake-up call for me when I visited the engineering school at the University of Virginia, and I went to the 3D printing lab, and one of those graduate students said, "Dr. Moran, if you can wait a few minutes, I have something for you." And he printed out this wrench. Here's what I learned that I think makes it all come together for us as educators, as learners, and as people out in the bigger community of Albermarle and beyond, that our world is going to change in terms of the work world. And advanced manufacturing is going to be one of the things that does that. And here's how it's going to happen. In another 5 to 10 years, we will likely, many of us, have 3D printers in our own homes. We will be downloading programs and printing out parts for things that we need to repair in our homes or tools instead of going to the local hardware store. Think about how different that world is going to be for not just you, but for Generation S. And we've got to be able to educate our kids up to that kind of a world. And yet at the same time, make sure that they are leaving our schools with the lifelong learning competencies that they need to be successful, no matter what the world throws at them, from the most complex and challenging problems to the greatest potential that we have to solve problems such as water shortages and global warming and political divisiveness. Our kids are going to need that, and I think that we are all in this together in taking on that challenge. And I'm just so proud of Albermarle County Public Schools for taking a step forward to say there's more than just a 4-item, one right answer bubble test that leads kids to the work they need. There's so much more, and we're taking on that challenge. And I thank you for letting me talk with you today.